Well, welcome. Thank you all very, very much for being here tonight to help us celebrate a wonderful event and a wonderful collection. Many people have worked very hard, so many that if I start naming them, I'll take up everybody else's time. But I just really appreciate all the work that everyone has put into this, and I appreciate you taking time from your Friday evening to join us. A little over a year ago, the UT libraries were fortunate to acquire a collection of more than 300 early printed Bibles and other rare books from the collection of the late Naseeb Shaheen, a noted Shakespeare scholar and professor of English at the University of Memphis for 40 years. This exceptional collection was brought to our attention by Dr. Michael Kowalski, a medievalist and former director of the Marco Institute for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. And the Marco Institute is also our co-host for this event tonight. In the intervening months, we've been doing all the things. You wonder what librarians do? Well, we've been doing all the things the librarians do for the last several months. We've been reviewing the collection, cataloging it, making sure that we're taking good care of it, that it has a good place in our stacks, that it's in all the national databases that it needs to be in so scholars from around the world can discover the collection. We've scanned part of the collection. We're going to scan more of it. So we've been working really hard to make this collection available. The centerpiece of the Shaheen Antiquarian Bible Collection is a group of about 100 English Bibles dating from the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, when the Christian scriptures were first translated into the vernacular languages of Europe. These early printed Bibles, along with psalters, prayer books, homilies, Greek and Latin Bibles, and early editions of literary works dating from the 16th and 17th century, form the core of the collection used by Dr. Shaheen in his studies of the Bible in literature, and most notably his study of biblical references in Shakespeare's plays. According to Dr. Shaheen's wishes, these extraordinary artifacts will now be available in our own special collections as an intact collection for reference by future scholars, students, anyone interested in Shakespeare, the Bible, or Renaissance literature. Dr. Shaheen gathered his Bibles and other works over 40 years, attending auctions and browsing book fairs and used bookstores, often during stops in London, on his annual trips to Europe, on his way to the Palestinian city of Ramallah, the Shaheen's family's hometown. When Dr. Shaheen died in 2009, he was still actively engaged in scholarship and teaching. He was a devoted educator and philanthropist. He lived frugally, preferring to donate his money to charity and, of course, to buy books. In addition to the great book collection he put together, he also endowed many college scholarship with other members of his family, donated to the constructions of several buildings on the campus of Birzeit University in Ramallah. I would like to thank Dr. Naseeb Shaheen's brother, Suki Shaheen, who unfortunately couldn't be with us tonight, for his help in transferring this exceptional collection to the University of Tennessee. I think that what Dr. Shaheen accomplished was quite remarkable. You know, it's the job of scholars to create new knowledge, to engage in a conversation with past scholars and past literary figures and past historical figures, to push the boundaries of our understanding of the past and our hope for the future and our current situation as well. Many scholars, most scholars, publish, and they publish a lot. They have long conversations with the past, and this results in books and articles and publications of all kinds. And that is a remarkable achievement for any scholar. And Dr. Shaheen certainly did that. But a smaller set of scholars do something even more remarkable. In addition to filling a bookshelf or two with their own publication, because of their devotion to scholarship, they're able to create a collection or a library that other students can use. to challenge the things that they've discovered, to continue this conversation with the past. So I like to think that what Dr. Shaheen accomplished wasn't just filling a bookshelf with his own publications, although that was quite remarkable. It wasn't just putting together a great collection, although that's remarkable. I think of what he did as a supreme act of scholarship, a very selfless activity. And I can imagine him browsing bookshops, searching for rare volumes, and pressing the booksellers and for the best prices for those rare volumes and all those things. So this evening is a tribute not only to his collection, but to his life and scholarly life in general. It's now my pleasure to introduce Heather Hirschfield, the Rigsby Director of the Marco Institute for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. And I'll mention again that the Marco Institute is one of our co-sponsors for this evening. We appreciate their partnership. Heather is a specialist in Shakespeare and Renaissance drama. Her most recent work is The End of Satisfaction, Drama and Repentance in Early Modern England, a study of the effect of shifting doctrines of penitence on the tragic conventions of the Renaissance stage. So her scholarly interests also align perfectly with this collection. So I'll invite Heather to come up, and she will also introduce our distinguished speaker. Join me in welcoming Heather.
Thank you, Steve. It's an honor for me to be invited both to celebrate the extraordinary acquisition of the Shaheen Collection and to introduce Professor Hannibal Hamlin of Ohio State University this evening. Dean Smith has already given you a sense of the contents of the Shaheen Collection, with its core of English, Latin, and Greek Bibles and other religious texts from the 16th and 17th centuries, including such essentials as the Elizabethan Book of Common Prayer and Book of Homilies. There are also monuments of the English literary Renaissance here, including Shakespeare's First Folio, Edmund Spenser's Faerie Queene, and Milton's Paradise Lost. The catalog is full of gems that make an English Renaissance scholar like me giddy. Holinshed's Chronicles, examples of religious polemics such as William Fulke's Confutation, the enormous collection of Beaumont and Fletcher's comedies and tragedies, a 17th century translation of the Quran. This is a working collection designed to enable the seminal scholarship of Dr. Naseeb Shaheen. Dr. Shaheen is the leading authority on Shakespeare's use of the Bible. I was taught, and I continue to teach my students, to consult his 3 volumes dedicated to Shakespeare's use of biblical references in the tragedies, comedies, and histories. This definitive series was collected in his almost 900-page Biblical References in Shakespeare's Plays. Dr. Shaheen's unique contribution in this work is that he not only documents Shakespeare's scriptural allusions, but he evaluates them against the bard's sources. As he explains, for a study of Shakespeare's biblical references to be of real value, it would have to ascertain the origin of his references. His volumes, which are based on meticulous research on Shakespeare's scriptural as well as historical and literary sources, enable scholars, quote, to determine which references Shakespeare borrowed from his plot sources and which biblical references were added by Shakespeare himself as part of his own design for the play. Dr. Shaheen assembled his collection to assure that he was working from the exact versions of the texts available to Shakespeare. The UT Libraries is now the beneficiary of that impulse towards precision. Dr. Shaheen's collection of pre-King James Bibles is one of the largest in the world. The Antiquarian Bible Collection includes more than 60 examples of the Geneva Bible, the scripture most often referenced in Shakespeare, as well as early printings of the so-called Great Bible, Bishop's Bible, Matthew's Bible, the Douay-Rheims version, and the King James Bible. If any scholar is poised to assess this tapestry of Bibles and their relation to English literature, it is tonight's speaker, Professor of English Hannibal Hamlin of the Ohio State University. The recipient of awards from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the American Council of Learned Societies, among others, Professor Hamlin's publications include Psalm Culture and Early Modern English Literature, as well as the King James Bible After 400 Years, Literary, Linguistic, and Cultural Influences, edited with Norman Jones, and the Sidney Psalter, Psalms of Philip and Mary Sidney, edited with Margaret Hannay, Michael Brennan, and Noel Kinnaman. His Psalm culture, from which I can say I have benefited immensely in my efforts to understand some aspects of the penitential cast of English literature, is a deep, powerful study of the ways in which the translating of the biblical Psalms shaped English religious and literary culture. Choice magazine, the barometer for reviews for academic libraries, calls the collection of essays in the King James Bible excellent and elegant. Professor Hamlin has been in the news recently as the co-curator with Stephen Galbraith of the astonishing exhibition Manifold Greatness, the Creation and Afterlife of the King James Bible. This was jointly developed by the Folger Shakespeare Library and the Bodleian Library at the University of Oxford with the assistance of the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas. The exhibit was on display at the Folger Shakespeare Library in D.C. from September 2011 until January 2012, and its traveling version has toured and is still touring until 2013, 40 libraries across the United States. We are grateful that Professor Hamlin has traveled in person to speak to us this evening, and I invite you to join me in welcoming him.
And so I was fully prepared. Thanks to Heather for a very generous introduction, and thanks to Steve. Thanks also to Jennifer Benedetto Beals for inviting me here. I'm really delighted to be here on this occasion and to celebrate the acquisition of the Shaheen Antiquarian Bible Collection. Before I plunge into Shakespeare and the Bible, I realized you've heard some about Naseeb Shaheen already, but I have a few words on that score myself. Naseeb Shaheen was not a sexy scholar. He wasn't a headliner at the MLA conference, his books didn't reach the New York Times bestseller list, and he wasn't a trendsetter of literary schools or theories. But he did important and useful work, which deserves higher praise than sexiness or popular appeal. His name belongs among those eminent scholars of essential reference works, like Geoffrey Bulla, who compiled narrative and dramatic sources of Shakespeare, or Morris Palmer Tilley, author of A Dictionary of the Proverbs in England in the 16th and 17th centuries. Those of us who study English literature are so familiar with the work of these scholars and rely on it so regularly that we are on a first-name basis. Well, actually, no. I realize we're on a last-name basis, but somehow there's an immediacy. A reference to Bulla, Tilley, or Shaheen is immediately understood with no further bibliographic information. You'll find these names in the lists of standard or abbreviations in all the best editions of Shakespeare's plays. I never met Professor Shaheen, but he's been in my life for decades. I first encountered his work as a graduate student in Toronto in 1990, when I was exploring biblical allusion in Shakespeare's Coriolanus. Shaheen's biblical references in Shakespeare's tragedies, a copy of which I lucked on at a local used bookstore, saved me countless hours of labor. Several years later, while pursuing a doctorate at Yale, I explored Shaheen's work further, investing in his whole massive volume on biblical references in Shakespeare's plays, and reading what he had to say about early modern Bibles and Shakespeare's experience of them. Naseeb Shaheen has stayed by my side ever since, and we've become ever closer as I've been writing my own book on the Bible in Shakespeare. Professor Shaheen's work was not interpretive. He was essentially a bibliographer, combing through Bibles and plays, and as Heather pointed out, many other works as well, in order to produce a definitive catalog of Shakespeare's references to the English Bible. Biblical references in Shakespeare's plays will not explain what those hundreds of references mean, but it provides the essential groundwork for such an explanation. Scholars like me can build upon Shaheen's foundations, knowing that we are building our house not upon the sand, but upon the rock. And as Professor Shaheen could tell you, that was a reference to Matthew chapter 7. The photo of Professor Shaheen opposite the title page of his book shows him standing proudly amidst his impressive personal collection of early modern Bibles. A dozen are stacked on a table in front of him, and several dozen more are on shelves behind him. But as you've heard, this is only a sample of the whole, which includes copies of non-biblical books that Shakespeare read as well, Montaigne's Essays, Holinshed's Chronicles, Plutarch's Lives, and more. The acquisition of such a collection on an academic salary borders on the miraculous. Any of you who have such a salary can attest to this. In today's antiquarian book market, it would be worth a small fortune. It testifies to a lifelong passion lurking beneath Shaheen's seemingly impassive exterior in the photo. There's a photo in the exhibition, so you can see what I mean. It was this Bible collection that enabled Shaheen's scholarly achievements, just as it will enable the work of so many more students and scholars here at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. In his plays, Shakespeare alludes to the Bible more than to any other work. The reason for this is simple. The Bible was the most important book in his world, the best known and most influential book in 16th and 17th century English culture. One of the primary goals of Protestant reformers in the early 16th century was to make the Bible available in the common vernacular languages everyone could understand. Martin Luther's first publications were Bible translations, and English reformers followed suit. The great hero of English Bible translation is William Tyndale, an Oxford-trained priest and scholar who was the first to translate most of the Bible into English from the original languages of Hebrew and Greek. He worked in hiding in Germany and the Netherlands, and his work was smuggled back into England secretly. He was caught, condemned, and publicly executed for his pains. He was sentenced to be burned, but as an act of mercy, he was strangled before the body was burned. I suppose that's merciful. Before his death, he managed to complete the New Testament and much of the Old Testament. Tyndale's translations became the basis for subsequent English Bibles, including the King James Bible of 1611. Since the King James is the basis for many modern translations, William Tyndale's words are still being read and heard around the world today. And as we featured in our exhibition at the Folger, they're actually the only words to have been heard from, the only Bible translation to have been read from outer space is the King James Version. So I like to think that even though Tyndale died on the scaffold, many centuries later, we could hear his words being read by astronauts. Strange. When Shakespeare was born in 1564, however, the officially authorized translation was the Great Bible, a combination of Tyndale's translations and those of Miles Coverdale, a colleague of his, compiled and revised during the reign of Henry VIII. England swung briefly back to Catholicism during the reign of Henry's daughter Mary, but with her death and the accession of her sister, or half-sister, Elizabeth, England's Protestant status was secured, and the English Bible was restored to its place at the center of English culture. The Bible was encountered most obviously in church. At Shakespeare's baptism at Holy Trinity, Stratford, on April 26, 1564, there would have been a reading from the 10th chapter of Mark, and much of the baptismal liturgy was interlaced with biblical language and references to water. The bidding prayer, for instance, refers to Noah and the ark, Israel passing through the Red Sea, and Jesus' baptism in the River Jordan. Shakespeare would have sat through the same service at the baptism of his own children in 1583 and 1585. At his wedding to Anne Hathaway in 1582, he would have heard Psalms 128 or 67, excerpts from Colossians, 1 Peter, and Ephesians, as well as the same sprinkling of biblical material through the liturgy. By this date, however, Holy Trinity had probably invested in a large pulpit-sized or lectern-sized copy of the Bishop's Bible, a translation prepared by Archbishop Matthew Parker and other leaders of Elizabeth's Church. It was first printed in 1568, thus when Shakespeare was roughly 4, and most of the readings in church services Shakespeare attended during his lifetime would have been from this translation. Shakespeare likely attended other baptisms and weddings as well, and he would certainly have attended the funerals of his father, his son Hamlet, and his brother Edmund. The burial service included powerful readings from Job, which was one of Shakespeare's favorite books, given the number of references to it in his plays. Most regularly, Shakespeare would have attended, either in Stratford, in London, or sometimes at the royal court, Sunday services of morning and evening prayer, occasionally a communion service, and the special services of the church calendar during Christmas, Holy Week, and other holidays. Universal church attendance was required by law, and the Bible formed the substance of the liturgy, so Shakespeare and his contemporaries would have listened to most of the Bible read aloud in longer readings and shorter snippets, year in and year out. Some biblical passages, like the stories of the Nativity and the Crucifixion, would have become especially familiar, since they were the focus of attention at key points in the church year. The Psalms were also especially well known, since they were repeated more regularly than any other biblical texts, and since they were set to music that made them easier to remember. Even apart from the church liturgy, however, Shakespeare's culture was a thoroughly biblical one. At every church service, congregants would hear a sermon on one of the day's biblical readings. In smaller parishes or churches without a competent preacher, hard to imagine there were such, these might have been drawn from the standard books of homilies circulated for that purpose. But in many churches, these sermons were original. On special feast days, it was not uncommon for hundreds to gather and listen to sermon marathons of 6 or 8 hours. In London, the commissioned open-air sermons at Paul's Cross were attended by as many as 6,000 people, and the audience could include everyone from the royal family to the grocer's apprentice. Sales of printed sermons rivaled those of playbooks. Sermons were popular reading as well as live entertainment. Bibles themselves were printed and sold in vast numbers. Few could afford the expensive large folios, but some editions were cheap and also printed in small sizes for the reading desk or even the coat pocket. Some smaller editions of the Bishop's Bible were printed, but the most popular Bible translation for personal or family use was the Geneva Bible. It was the work of Protestant exiles in Geneva during the reign of Catholic Queen Mary. It was first published in 1560 with a dedication to the young Queen Elizabeth, but it was never adopted for use in churches. Despite its unofficial status, however, the Geneva Bible consistently outsold all other Bibles for the next 50 to 60 years, and it remained popular until after the Restoration of 1660. Probably its greatest appeal lay in its handy interpretive aids, maps, diagrams, editorial introductions to books and chapters, tables, indexes, and especially the copious notes in the margins, providing alternative translations, cross-references to other Bible verses, and interpretive glosses of difficult passages. It was really the first study Bible, or even, if you like, a kind of Bible for dummies. Though, of course, not everybody who was reading it was a dummy. The Bible was even unavoidable for those who never cracked its covers or who slept through the sermons. Biblical characters and stories were in church windows and sculpture, but they were common motifs in non-church architecture, too. They also appeared on more everyday and ephemeral surfaces. The wealthy lived in the midst of rich tapestries, such as those of Abraham, Joshua, Tobias, and St. Paul, that Henry VIII bought for Hampton Court. Poorer folk had to make do with painted cloths depicting Susanna and the elders or Daniel in the lion's den that hung on the walls of the local tavern. For example, a painting of the prodigal son decorates Mistress Quickly's Boar's Head Tavern in Shakespeare's Henry IV, Part 2. Biblical images appeared on clothing, furniture, tableware, weapons, and embroidered book bindings. Biblical ballads were popular, and so was biblical drama, even after the disappearance of the medieval mystery plays. For instance, in addition to George Peele's The Love of King David and Fair Bethsabee, dating from 1593 or 94, one of the few biblical plays that survives, Robert Greene, the playwright, wrote a play on Job, and there were plays in the public theaters about Nebuchadnezzar, Judas, Samson, and Joshua, produced through the 1590s and into the 17th century. Even puppet plays told biblical tales. Apparently in Coventry, puppet plays or puppets performed the fall of Jerusalem in 1584, 1605, and 1614. In 1628, Thomas Crossfield saw a truly monumental puppet play in Oxford that featured Adam and Eve in Eden, the expulsion from paradise, Cain and Abel, Abraham and Isaac, Nebuchadnezzar and the fiery furnace, the nativity and the adoration of the three kings, the flight into Egypt and the slaughter of the innocents, and the parable of Dives and Lazarus. That's a play I would love to see. With puppets, no less. So extensive a biblical culture meant not only that biblical material was familiar to Shakespeare, but that he could count on it being familiar to his audience. This is, of course, how allusion works. For example, when Orlando, at the beginning of As You Like It, says resentfully to his brother, "Shall I keep your hogs and eat husks with them?" Shakespeare's audience would have recognized the allusion to the parable of the prodigal son. And he would fain have filled his belly with the husks that the swine ate, but no man gave them him. This is the parable in which a son asks his father for his inheritance and then squanders it on, as the Bible says, riotous living. After toiling as a lonely swineherd, the son decides to go back home and beg his father's forgiveness. The father greets him with open arms, makes a feast of the fatted calf, and celebrates that he who was lost is now found. The prodigal son story was a popular one, especially in drama, perhaps partly for social and economic reasons. There may simply have been lots of prodigal sons kicking around England in those years. Primogeniture is a terrible thing for a younger son. The popularity of the parable made it all the more likely that Shakespeare's allusion would be recognized. But the key to the allusion here is verbal, in the combination of the words hogs and husks. Shakespeare uses the word husks only 5 times in all his works, and at least 2 of the others are also allusions to the prodigal son. In Henry IV, Part 1, Falstaff says of his pathetic troop of conscripts, "You would think I had 150 tattered prodigals lately come from swine-keeping, from eating draff and husks." Since he mentions prodigals explicitly, this is an obvious reference to the parable, and we expect the mock Puritan Falstaff to know his scripture. Falstaff is constantly dropping biblical allusions, usually for blasphemous purposes. A more subtle reference occurs in The Tempest. When Prospero first enslaves Ferdinand, he tells him Ferdinand is the young man who will eventually marry Miranda, but Prospero doesn't want it to be too easy, so he has him carry around timber for a while. Prospero tells Ferdinand, "Thy food shall be the fresh brook mussels, withered roots, and husks wherein the acorn cradled." Sometimes a husk is just a husk, of course, but a sotto voce allusion to the prodigal son might be appropriate in this scene. Ferdinand is hardly a spendthrift, but he has become lost to his father and family, and he will shortly be put to menial labor. There will also eventually be an emotional reunion when his father realizes that, in the words from the parable, "My son was dead and is alive again, and he was lost, but he is found." The prodigal son parable is a kind of resurrection story, and the romances are all about resurrection. These threads may have been enough to suggest to Shakespeare a parallel to the biblical story. Whether this instance is an allusion, however, is a tricky question. The single word husks in The Tempest is not much to go on, but it might be recognizable to somebody who knew the story well, since the husks crop up even in paraphrased retellings of the story, like Robert Holland's verse History of the Prodigal Son, from his The Holy History of Our Lord and Savior, published in 1594. When he had spent all willfully, there rose a dearth throughout the land, and he there pinched with penury was forced to go then out of hand, to serve, nor durst the man repine, to keep and feed his master's swine. Where oft, for want of better food, husks with this swine the youth did eat, and then the same thought very good, for no man gave him better meat. And sometimes in his misery he wanted husks, assuredly. It's masterful. In 1615, Richard Braithwaite used the language of the prodigal son parable in his poem A Cashiered Courtier, part of his satirical collection A Strappado for the Devil. But prithee say, what shall Lampetra do? Lampetra is a courtier who cannot woo. As other courtiers make a foolish show of what they have not? No. It is decreed, being boorish bred, he must with boors go feed on husks and haws, and that he may retain some courtly garb, his ruins to maintain, i' the country must this rustic swain be placed, to purchase pardons when the judgment's past. Shakespeare is also not the only dramatist to use the husks to allude to the parables of the prodigal son. In the second part of Thomas Heywood's The Fair Maid of the West, published in 1631, Clem, a clown, is down on his luck and bemoans his misfortune. But then he remembers that he has a trade to fall back on, drawing wine. Now, I bethink me, I have a trade, and that, they say, will stick by a man when his friends fail him. The city is hard by, and I'll see and I can be entertained to my old trade of drawing wine. If it be but an under-skinker, I care not. Better do so than like a prodigal feed upon husks and acorns. Tellingly, not only does Clem mention the husks, just as Prospero does, but he also mentions the acorns, though Prospero's point was that Ferdinand would get only the husks. Returning to Orlando and As You Like It, the allusion to the prodigal son is no more perfect a fit for him than it is for Ferdinand. Like Ferdinand, Orlando is no spendthrift, wasting his time and money with riotous living. His brother, who has inherited the family estate, primogeniture again, is keeping him in poverty and at heavy labor, despite having promised to his father to raise Orlando to be a gentleman. This lack of fit between the text alluding and the text alluded to is actually characteristic of Shakespeare's biblical allusions. Sometimes a biblical allusion simply suggests that something in one of the plays is rather like something in the Bible. This can be interesting in itself, especially if the biblical something brings with it a narrative context or a set of ideas that adds depth to the dramatic something. On the other hand, many allusions essentially say, here's something that's rather like something in the Bible, but, you know, actually it's also rather different, or really not like it at all. Allusion is thus a technique that stimulates the interpretive skills of the audience. Thinking of Orlando as a kind of prodigal son is intriguing, but in order to properly understand him, we must recognize that, unlike the biblical character, he has not brought about his own misfortune. Furthermore, we know that no happy homecoming with fatted calf is likely for Orlando, since his father is dead. As Professor Shaheen noted many years ago, Shakespeare's allusions to the prodigal son parable tell us which version of the Bible Shakespeare had in mind when he was writing, since the Geneva Bible was the only one to use the word husks in this passage. The Bishop's Bible had the word cods. This also indicates that Shakespeare, like so many of his contemporaries, must have had his own copy of the Geneva Bible, since it was not read in churches. He had this translation not only on his mind then, but on his desk. Shakespeare does sometimes allude to the Bible in the Bishop's Bible translation, or in the Psalms translation of Miles Coverdale, both of which he would have heard in church. But when the language of a specific version, a specific translation can be identified in Shakespeare's plays, it's most often the Geneva Bible. Another example of the way Shakespeare's allusions twist, subvert, or manipulate the biblical texts they allude to is in Bottom's famous speech in A Midsummer Night's Dream. You'll remember that after he's been given the head of an ass and had Titania, queen of the fairies, fall in love with him, Bottom is disenchanted and put to sleep. Upon waking, he tries to piece out his previous dreamlike experience. I've had a most rare vision. I have had a dream past the wit of man to say what dream it was. Man is but an ass if he go about to expound this dream. Methought I was, there is no man can tell what. Methought I was, and methought I had, and usually an actor at that point gestures to missing ears. But man is but a patched fool if he will offer to say what methought I had. The eye of man hath not heard, the ear of man hath not seen, man's hand is not able to taste, his tongue to conceive, nor his heart to report what my dream was. Bottom's speech is wonderful nonsense, a parody of synesthesia, in which the different senses are mixed and muddled, but the humor is intensified if one recognizes an allusion to Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians, wherein Paul writes, "The eye hath not seen, and the ear hath not heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things which God hath prepared for them that love him." Bottom is not simply scrambling senses or mixing up nouns and verbs. He's parodying Paul's description of the wondrous mysteries of God's love. Of course, Bottom can't be conscious of either the allusion or the parody, since despite his English appearance and language, he's living in ancient Athens. Shakespeare's biblical allusions are often similarly anachronistic, as when characters in pre-Christian plays like King Lear or Julius Caesar allude to the Christian New Testament. Yet the audience catches the allusion, and it enriches the scene in complex ways. Shakespeare's treatment of the mechanicals, Bottom and his friends, is always more subtle than it first appears. Bottom is an ass, certainly, even without the actual head of one, and his vision speech is a comical muddle. Yet when he says that he will call the ballad of his dream Bottom's Dream, because it hath no bottom, his statement is deep as well as silly. A bottom is an ass, in another sense, and Bottom punningly both is and has an ass, but his experience was genuinely magical and is legitimately bottomless in the sense of being unfathomable, a word which means much the same thing. Bottom's speech is similarly both deep and shallow. In one sense, it's nonsense, since eyes can never hear and ears can never see. In another sense, however, Bottom's experience could be said to be even more transcendent than the one described by Paul. In Paul's description, the mysteries of God's love are beyond anything that the eye has seen or the ear heard. In Bottom's description, taken seriously, his dream goes beyond even what we can conceive, let alone experience, since we simply cannot imagine eyes hearing, ears seeing, or hands tasting. Bottom's dream may be truly extrasensory. Many of Shakespeare's plays are thick with biblical allusions, even though a modern American audience may not be aware of it. Macbeth, for instance, contains a thread of allusions to the crucifixion of Christ recounted in the Gospels. Most obviously, at the beginning of the play, a captain reports that in the fierceness of their fighting, Macbeth and Banquo memorize another Golgotha. Golgotha is the place of the skull outside Jerusalem where Jesus is crucified. What the captain has in mind is probably just a place of skulls, blood, and death. But for the audience, the allusion evokes the crucifixion, and later allusions support it. When Lady Macbeth famously worries about washing the damned spot of blood off her hands, or when Macbeth himself wonders, will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? Shakespeare's audience would surely have recognized the allusion to the disclaimer of Pilate. Pilate took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just man. Look you to it. Also, before the assassination of Duncan, Macbeth says to himself, if it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says to Judas, just before he betrays him to the soldiers, that thou doest, do quickly. The repeated varied forms of the verb to do, the similar balanced syntax, and the use of the same adjective quickly mark the allusion for the attentive and biblically informed listener. The point seems to be that Macbeth's betrayal of Duncan is Judas-like, given that he is a friend and subject of the king. Judas is also invoked in the scene where Macbeth is greeted by the witches. They cry to him 3 times, all hail Macbeth, all hail, well, I can take it as given. This seems an ordinary enough greeting, relatively innocuous. But in fact, whenever Shakespeare uses this phrase, he seems to have in mind the scene of Judas's betrayal of Jesus. In the Gospels, Judas either just kisses Jesus, as in Matthew and Luke, or he says, Master, Master, as in Mark. However, when this scene was dramatized in the medieval Corpus Christi plays, the great biblical cycles played every year in cities like York, Coventry, and Chester, Judas says to his former master, all hail. There's no way of knowing for sure, but it may be that Shakespeare attended the performance of the Chester cycle when he was a child. In his early play, at any rate, Henry VI, Part 3, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the later King Richard III, gives his nephew a kiss, but then says in an aside, to say the truth, so Judas kissed his master and cried all hail when he meant all harm. Similarly, in Richard II, after his cousin Henry Bolingbroke has deposed Richard and brought him before himself and his supporters, Richard likens himself to the betrayed Christ. Yet I well remember the favors of these men. Were they not mine? Did they not sometime cry, all hail to me? So Judas did to Christ. Judas is not explicitly mentioned by the witches in Macbeth, but Shakespeare most certainly has him in mind when he uses the familiar greeting. Of course, Macbeth is the one being greeted, which would seem to put him in the position of Jesus. This hardly makes sense. On the other hand, the witches certainly mean him no good, and we may remember this scene later on in the play when other allusions point to Macbeth himself as the Judas. Even then, the allusions do not really suggest that Macbeth is in some way actually Judas, nor that he and his wife are Pilate, nor even that King Duncan, their victim, is Christ. For early modern English men and women, however, Christ was the preeminent innocent victim, just as Judas was the ultimate model of the betrayer. That's why Dante has Judas at the very bottom of hell in his Inferno, being chewed on by one of the mouths of Satan. For Shakespeare to compare Macbeth to Judas by means of biblical allusions adds depth and resonance to his crime of regicide. Similarly, the allusions to Pilate washing his hands encourage the audience to interpret Macbeth and Lady Macbeth's gestures in light of the biblical scene. As any Christian would know, Pilate failed in his attempt to wash Christ's blood off his hands. He's been judged guilty for centuries. And this suggests that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth will fail too. There are many more biblical allusions in Macbeth, but no passage is more densely biblical than Macbeth's famous soliloquy after hearing of his wife's death. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. With Professor Shaheen to guide us, we can discover that the dusty death is from Psalm 22. Thou shalt bring me into the dust of death. The brief candle is from Job 18. His candle shall be put out with him. Or perhaps chapter 21. How shall the candle of the wicked be put out? There are several possible sources for the walking shadow Macbeth mentions. Psalm 102, my days are gone like a shadow. Job 8, for our days upon earth are but a shadow. Or Psalm 39, for man walketh in a vain shadow. The tale told, though not the idiot, belongs or alludes to Psalm 90. We bring our years to an end as it were a tale that is told. Perhaps in combination with Ecclesiastes 20, verse 18. A man without grace is as a foolish tale which is oft told. The fretting probably also derives from Psalm 39. Thou makest his beauty to consume away, like as it were a moth fretting a garment. Psalms 39 and 90 are more broadly relevant to Macbeth's thinking in this speech. Macbeth's appeal to the witches in Act 4, Scene 1, when he asked them to reveal more of his future. It's the famous scene where he gets these various visions called up from the beyond, and there's a long procession of kings and a talking head. That scene is essentially in the mode of Psalm 39, verse 3. Lord, let me know mine end and the number of my days, that I may be certified how long I have to live. That's essentially what Macbeth is asking. Or Psalm 90, verse 12, teach us to number our days. Macbeth's yesterday may echo Psalm 90, verse 4, for 1,000 years in thy sight are but as yesterday. Some of these Bible passages are also alluded to or adapted in the Book of Common Prayer's burial service. For instance, that man flieth as it were a shadow, or the familiar ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The burial service may also be the source, interestingly, of the witch's prophecy. This is one of the things they reveal to Macbeth in this key scene. They tell him that none of woman born shall harm Macbeth. The priest's prayer at the grave in the burial service begins, man that is born of a woman hath but a short time to live. The ultimate source of that phrase, actually, is Job chapter 14. Man that is born of woman is of short continuance and full of trouble. Shakespeare may have in mind here either the burial service or the passage from Job, or perhaps both. And an allusion to either or both would be meaningful to the audience, since they emphasize the universality of death and the transience of life. The allusions add grim irony to the witch's prophecy, since while Macbeth thinks the prophecy signifies his invulnerability, the allusion actually suggests that it marks his doom. Shakespeare's allusions to the Bible are legion, as Professor Shaheen has helped us realize. No book was better known to Shakespeare and his audience than the Bible, and the better we know the English Bible, the better we can understand Shakespeare's plays. The Shaheen Antiquarian Bible Collection will be an essential resource for students, teachers, and scholars working toward that understanding. But the Bible was central for almost every aspect of early modern English culture, so the Shaheen Collection will benefit not just scholars like me, following in Shaheen's own footsteps, but anyone interested in the cultural history of Tudor and Stuart England. It's been my pleasure and privilege to speak in honor of this influential and generous scholar and of the collection he created and passed on. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
Questions? Yes, one in the back.
You think that
Sorry? Well, one has to discriminate. I mean, in that last sentence of yours, the most popular Bible was not actually the one the churches used. Right. The Geneva Bible was extremely popular for the better part of a century. It outsold any other Bible. It was available in all sorts of different shapes and sizes, some of them inexpensive, some of them lavish, and it had all of this apparatus that people seemed to love and enjoy. It was never an official Bible for the church, partly because it was translated by a sort of hotter variety of Protestants, this group of Protestant exiles living in Geneva during the reign of Catholic Mary. Some people took a little, there was certain of the notes seemed to irritate people in authority when they raised questions about the extent to which one should obey kings over God. At any rate, the reason really probably for the production of the Bishop's Bible in 1568 was that Elizabeth and her bishops wanted to produce a new translation of the Bible that would be a little more comfortable for them than the Geneva. And that then was read in the churches, but it never caught on with people. People still clung to their little Genevas. So that's, I mean, in truth, actually, I should point out that the vast majority of allusions to the Bible in Shakespeare can't be attributed to one translation or another. Sometimes because the allusions are too brief or fleeting, other times because the Bibles are so similar. They're all sort of feeding off of each other. I mean, nobody actually starts from scratch. So every new Bible translation sort of incorporates large chunks of its predecessors. So for many passages, the Geneva Bible, the Bishop's Bible, even the Great Bible and the King James, they're all identical. But when you can identify a specific translation, it's usually to the Geneva, sometimes to the bishop, which you would have heard in church, and sometimes, especially with the Psalms, to the Psalms of Miles Coverdale, which were the Psalms that were used in the church service as well. In truth, I mean, the other thing to point out, sorry, I'm sort of taking this question and running with it, but another thing to point out is that Shakespeare probably wasn't particularly interested in which translation he was borrowing from. It's not as if, I mean, he was simply using biblical material, and in one case he had a version lodged in his head from hearing it in church. In another case, he may have had a version in mind because he was reading it at home. It wasn't as if his use of the Geneva or the bishops was particularly pointed in one way or another. But it is interesting. It is interesting to think about which version Shakespeare was aware of and how he came to know them. That's. That's a loaded question. As my Renaissance colleagues can attest, there's a lot of blood has been shed over this. You know, was Shakespeare a Catholic? Was he a Protestant? There's even an argument that he was Jewish. That hasn't gone very far. It's not a question that I've explored in any huge depth, though I've read a lot about it. I've never been convinced by any of the arguments for Shakespeare's personal faith one way or the other. My sense is that overwhelmingly what he's doing in the plays is using the Bible for dramatic purposes. Even when which isn't to say that he's not interested in theology, but even when he's interested in theology, it seems to me, he's not making some kind of polemical point. He's simply exploring a set of ideas that connects to these biblical questions, that may connect to topics that were of interest in the day, having to do with politics or government or marriage and male-female relations. The Bible was simply, to an extent that we really can't grasp, it was the bedrock of the culture. I mean, almost everything was thought of in some way or another in terms of the Bible. it comes, and because it's so universally known, it's a great means by which Shakespeare can connect with and manipulate his audience through these allusions.
One more question?
Yeah, I touched on it in your work with Shakespeare's references to the Bible. Have you been able to notice patterns of using certain biblical passages or books that give rise to comments for Shakespeare and then repeating over time? Like moments in his career when he wanted to speak context?
I think there are. I mean, Naseeb Shaheen was, I mean, he has all sorts of catalogs and indices and tells you the sort of frequency of allusions. Shakespeare, according to him, and I have no reason to doubt those findings, Shakespeare seems to have had a particular interest in the wisdom books. He loved Job and Ecclesiastes and Ecclesiasticus. The apocryphal books were part of the, I mean, they were used in the liturgy and read more widely than they are now. I've noticed in my own work that there, for instance, Job, which Shakespeare seems generally to have liked and been interested in. I think partly because it's so problematic and puzzling, and there's a lot to sort of worry out. I've worked on King Lear, which I think is very, very deeply and consistently engaged with the Book of Job and the problem of innocent suffering and the question of divine providence. But I was talking to colleague Gretchen Minton, who co-edited the new Arden edition of Timon of Athens, and she pointed out to me that there's also a lot of engagement with Job in that play, and according to her and her co-editor, they date Timon to about the same time. So it seems as if that at around that time Shakespeare was really thinking about the Book of Job. That's the only instance I can think of, but it suggests that maybe there are other things to discover too. That you know, at certain points he's really sort of interested in certain questions or in certain biblical books.
Thank you so much for making this such a wonderful.
Thank you.
Here, the exhibit is open now if you'd like to go back to it or if you didn't have a chance to see it beforehand. Thank you for being here.
Well, I was just trying to...
Thank you.